The morning Charles Whitmore decided to destroy his son's engagement, the city was still dark. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 52nd floor office, a glass of water untouched on the desk behind him. Anne looked down at the street grid below the way a man looks at a chessboard he has been studying for a long time. The Whitmore Group occupied the top 4 floors of the tallest privately owned building in the city. Charles had built it himself, not inherited it, not stumbled into it. 28 years of decisions that other men called ruthless and he called precise. He had never been wrong about a person in those 28 years. Not once. Until, apparently, now. His son James was going to marry an egg seller. The report was on the desk behind him. 3 pages, printed by his personal assistant at 6:15 that morning, because Charles had been awake since 4. Evelyn Davies, 24 years old, no university degree, no family to speak of, a dead mother, a younger brother nobody seemed to know much about, a stall in the covered market on Hargraves Lane, where she sold eggs and seasonal vegetables 6 days a week. James had met her 8 months ago, when his car broke down 2 streets from the market and he had walked in out of the rain. He had called her the most honest person he had ever spoken to. He had said this to his father's face, across the dinner table, with the particular calm of a man who has already made up his mind and is merely informing you. Charles had not said anything at that dinner. He had listened. He had, for the first time in years, not trusted his own instincts immediately. That period of restraint was over. The petty cash discrepancy had been discovered by his housekeeper Margaret 3 weeks ago. £40 short 1 week, 60 the next. The household account for Ashworth Hall, the Whitmore family estate where James had been bringing Evelyn every Sunday for the past 2 months, ran a small operational fund for tradespeople and deliveries. It was kept in a locked tin in the kitchen office. Margaret had a key. The chef had a key. And on 3 separate Sundays, Evelyn Davies had been left alone in the kitchen corridor for 15 to 20 minutes while James was upstairs with Charles in the study. The footage from the kitchen's internal camera was inconclusive. The angle was wrong, but the pattern was not. £40, £60, £135 over 6 weeks from a woman who earned what she earned selling eggs in a covered market. Charles turned from the window. He picked up his phone and made a call. "I need a car at 7, he said. Not the usual one. Something that doesn't draw attention. He had not yet decided exactly what he was going to do. He told himself this. Booth had already chosen his clothes. A plain gray jacket, dark trousers, a flat cap he had not worn in years. He told himself this meant nothing. It was lying to himself, and somewhere beneath the precision of 28 years of good decisions, he knew it. The covered market on Hargraves Lane opened at 7:30. Charles arrived at 8:05, which meant the market was already alive. The high roof catching the sound of 100 conversations, the smell of bread and something cold and green and alive, the light coming through the skylights in long diagonal bars that turned the dust in the air into something almost beautiful. He had not been inside a market like this in 30 years. He had forgotten that markets sounded like this. He had forgotten that they smelled like this. He found the egg stall without asking anyone. She was behind the long wooden table laid with trays of eggs, arranged by size, a hand-painted chalkboard listing the prices behind her. She was wearing a dark green apron over a cream sweater, her dark hair pulled back, and she was wrapping a dozen eggs in paper for a woman in a yellow coat with a small dog. She was talking as she wrapped, not the aggressive cheerfulness of someone performing helpfulness, but the easy, particular attention of someone genuinely interested in what the woman was telling her. Charles watched from behind a column of hanging dried herbs and garlic that the adjacent stall had arranged in a curtain. It was testing her. He knew it. He had not dressed this way by accident. He approached the stall when the woman in yellow had gone. He set a £5 note on the table, pointed at the closest tray of eggs, and said, in the flattest tone he could manage, "6, whatever you have." Evelyn Davies looked at him directly, not at the money, at him. "Medium or large?" she said. "Medium." She began selecting eggs, unhurried, turning each one slightly in her fingers before placing it in the paper bag. She had, he noticed, a particular way of working, steady, economical, no wasted movement. She counted the change back into his palm coin by coin, which nobody did anymore. And when she looked up again, her eyes were level with his, and there was nothing in them that suggested she was performing anything at all. Anything else? No, Charles said. It stood there for a moment longer than he needed to. She had already moved to the next customer, an elderly man with a cloth bag, and she greeted him by name. Charles walked back through the market the way he had come, the eggs in his hand, feeling something he did not have a word for yet. It did not change anything. Pattern was pattern. Evidence was evidence. Character could be concealed behind a pleasant face. He had learned that at considerable cost, 20 years ago, from a business partner he had trusted completely. That lesson had cost him 11 months and £4 million. He did not intend to pay it twice. He made 2 more calls before he reached the car. The Sunday lunch at Ashworth Hall had been a tradition Charles maintained because his wife Eleanor, who had died 11 years ago, had started it, and he could not bring himself to end something she had begun. It was the one inheritance he had accepted without question. 14 rooms in the house, and the only one that ever felt warm was the dining room on a Sunday afternoon, with the long table set and something in the oven since morning. This Sunday, James arrived at noon with Evelyn. Margaret met them at the door as she always did. Carolyn Ashford arrived 20 minutes later, uninvited, as she had been uninvited 3 times in the past month, which was itself a thing Charles had chosen not to address yet because Carolyn's father held a 7% stake in the Whitmore Group's northern development, and Charles was still deciding whether that stake mattered more than the irritation. Caroline was tall and precise and had the kind of beauty that required constant maintenance and radiated the awareness of its own requirements. She had been engaged to James for 8 months before James ended it, which was 14 months ago, and she had not yet fully understood that it was over. She called Charles Charles when other people weren't listening, and Mr. Whitmore and Company, which he found theatrical. She brought wine she knew he liked. She was very good at being almost exactly what a person wanted. He had not noticed, until recently, how much effort it took. Lunch proceeded without incident until the moment between the main course and the dessert, when Charles set down his fork and looked at Evelyn across the table and said quietly and without prelude, "I'd like to speak to you directly about something." The table went still. James looked at his father. Margaret, carrying plates out from the kitchen doorway, stopped without turning around. "Of course," Evelyn said. Her voice did not change. She set her own fork down with the same care she had shown when selecting eggs in the market. "There is a shortfall in the household operational account," Charles said. "It has occurred on several occasions. The occasions correspond with your visits here." Silence. "I'm not making an accusation," he said, in the tone of a man making an accusation. "I am raising a matter that requires an explanation." He watched her face. He was good at watching faces. It was perhaps the skill he had spent the most years developing. He looked for the micro-expression of guilt, the eyes cutting sideways, the small contraction around the mouth, the breath held half a second too long. What he found instead was something he had not prepared for. She looked at him steadily. She did not flush. She did not look at James for rescue. She did not look around the room. She looked at Charles Whitmore directly, the way she had looked at him across the egg stall, and when she spoke, her voice was low and even and unhurried. "Mr. Whitmore, you can test my blood if you like. You'll find the same thing running through me that runs through every person in this market. And the only difference between us is that I have never once been ashamed of it." Then she said nothing more. Carolyn, at the far end of the table, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. James said, "Dad." "James." One word. Charles did not raise his volume. He did not need to. "Please." Margaret set the dessert plates down, one by one, in the silence that followed. The clinking of ceramic was the only sound in the room for a long moment. "I think," Charles said finally, "that it would be best if you waited in the sitting room while I verify a few things." Evelyn stood. She smoothed her skirt once, not nervously, but with the particular tidiness of someone who has been raised to leave a room the way they found it. She walked to the door without rushing. She paused at the threshold. "I'll be there," she said, and then she was gone. The silence she left behind was louder than anything anyone at the table said afterward. He told himself he was being thorough. That was the word he used, privately, in the car an hour later, sitting in traffic 2 streets from Ashworth Hall. Thorough, not suspicious, not ashamed. Thorough, a man who had built what he had built by being thorough. He had not called the police. He told himself this was because there was no confirmed theft yet, only a pattern. This was true. It was also true that something had happened in the dining room when she spoke. Something that had gone through him like a current he didn't have a name for. And he needed to understand it before he did anything irreversible. He had let her leave on foot. He had followed in the borrowed car slowly 2 streets back, the way a man follows when he does not want to admit to himself that he is following. She walked quickly. She did not look behind her. She carried a canvas bag over one shoulder, and she walked the way she did everything else, with the specific economy of someone who has never had the luxury of doing anything twice. The city changed around her as she walked. The wide streets of the Ashworth district gave way to the functional gray of the commercial blocks, which gave way to something narrower and older. The kind of streets the property development catalogs do not photograph. The pavement changed. The light changed. The cars parked at the curbs changed. Older, dented, some with missing wing mirrors. The shops changed from boutiques to off-licenses to laundrettes. Charles drove slowly. He had been in this part of the city before, years ago, for a site inspection that had come to nothing. He had not come back. Iscar did not belong on these streets. He was aware of it the way a person is aware of wearing the wrong shoes. The engine sound was wrong. The color was wrong. He slowed to a crawl and kept his distance. She turned left onto a street that the sat-nav did not have a name for. Just a line on the map. It was the kind of street that had happened rather than been planned. A row of low buildings in varying stages of tolerating the years. A bin bag tied to a lamppost. A child's bicycle locked to a drain pipe with a combination lock that was newer and cleaner than anything else on the block. The pavement ended at the corner and became packed dirt, and the streetlights were spaced so far apart that the pools of light they cast barely touched each other. She stopped at a door on the ground floor of a building 3, from the end. The building was 2 stories, brick gone gray with damp, a crack in the render that ran from the guttering down to the second-floor window. The door was wooden, painted dark blue, and it had a single lock that was clearly new, polished chrome that caught the light, incongruous against the worn wood. She put the key in without looking at it, the way a person opens a door they have opened 1,000 times. Charles pulled the car to the curb at the end of the street and turned the engine off. It sat for a moment. He did not know what he had expected. A pawn shop, a contact, something that made the pattern legible in the way he had already half-arranged it in his mind. He got out of the car. He walked slowly up the street on the opposite side, his hands in his pockets, his cap low. There was a broken ground-floor window in the building adjacent to hers, boarded with plywood. One corner of the board pulled away from the frame, leaving a triangular gap that looked directly toward her lit window. He crossed the street. He stood at the gap. He told himself this was the last step, that he was almost done being thorough. The window of her ground-floor flat was uncurtained at the corner, a few inches of clear glass where the fabric didn't quite reach the frame. The room beyond was small. A lamp on a low table threw a warm orange circle of light onto the wall. There was a single bed against the far wall, a chair beside it, and a small fold-out table near the window with a glass of water and 2 items he couldn't quite make out. He heard her voice first, warm, completely different from the voice at the dining table, not diminished, fuller, like a frequency he hadn't known was missing until it was present. "I'm home," she said, not a statement, a gift, and then a boy's voice, hoarse and a little unsteady, "You're late. I was starting to think you weren't coming." "I'm never not coming," she said. "You know that." The sound of the canvas bag set down. Movement. Charles shifted his angle slightly, the cold of the brick wall against his shoulder. He could see more now. The boy on the bed was young, 18, 19 at most, thin in the way that is not thinness from choice, pale in the way that is not paleness from constitution. It was propped against 2 pillows, and he had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who spend a great deal of time in bed. A small device was on the table beside him, a glucose monitor, the kind his own doctor had once shown him in a different context. Evelyn had opened the canvas bag. She was laying items on the fold-out table with the same care she used for eggs. Insulin pens, a box of testing strips, A paper bag from a pharmacy, the receipt still stapled to the outside. She had also taken out a small wrapped portion of something from the kitchen. He recognized the paper from Ashworth Hall, the cream-waxed paper Margaret used for everything. She set it beside him without comment. The boy looked at the insuling pens. He looked at his sister. "How many weeks is that?" he said. "Enough weeks," she said. "Don't count." Ev, Oli. Her voice did not change. Quiet. Absolute. Don't count. She uncapped the first pen with the particular efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times. She administered it with a steadiness that should not have surprised him. She was steady in everything he had seen her do, and when it was done, she placed her palm flat on the boy's forehead for a moment, the way a mother does. Though she was not his mother. She was his entire supply chain, his only logistics, his whole system of survival. The boy, Oliver, it would learn the name later, the name that would appear on every document from this point forward, looked up at his sister and said, in the flat, honest way of a young man too tired for anything except the truth, "I cost you everything, don't I?" It was not a question. "Oliver," she said. She sat on the edge of the bed. She did not perform comfort. She was simply present, the way a person is present when they have decided that the room they are in is the only room that exists. "You didn't cost me anything I wasn't going to spend." Charles Whitmore stepped back from the gap in the plywood. It stood against the brick wall of the adjacent building in the dark between two streetlights, and he could not move. His hands were in his pockets and they were shaking. Not from cold, the evening was not cold, and he understood that the thing happening inside his chest was not something he had a business term for. He tried to find one anyway. He could not. He had been wrong. It had been precisely, completely, categorically wrong, not in a way that could be recontextualized or partially retrieved, but in the absolute way that 28 years of being right does not prepare a person for. He had assembled a case. He had brought it to his dining room. It had sat across a table from a woman who had said nothing she needed to defend, because she had done nothing that required defense, and had watched her leave with the careful dignity of someone who has survived being underestimated too many times to be surprised by it anymore. She had taken money from his household account, £135 over 6 weeks. It was currently keeping the boy in that room alive. It leaned against the wall. He could not start walking yet. His legs were not ready. It stood in the space between the streetlights, with the city going about its evening around him, and he thought about the woman in the yellow coat with the small dog, and the elderly man with the cloth bag whom she'd greeted by name, and the way she had counted his change back coin by coin, and the look she had given him across the dining table. Steady, undefended, morally complete, and he felt the specific vertigo of a man discovering that the architecture he has been standing on for a long time is built on something that isn't there. A did not know how long he stood there. He walked back to the car very slowly. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time before he tried the ignition. When he did try it, his hands were still not fully steady. On the drive back he called, "No one." He said nothing. He drove through the changing city, the packed dirt street becoming paving, the narrow buildings opening into the wider functional gray, the commercial blocks giving way to the wide, clean avenues of the Ashworth district, and he understood, for the first time in a long time, that he had made a decision he could not unmake by simply making a better decision. Some things, once done, require something more than correction. They require repair. He went through the records himself that night. He was thorough. The one thing he had always been, the one thing the situation had revealed, could be aimed in entirely the wrong direction. He pulled every entry from the household account for the past 3 months. He called Margaret, who had been with the family for 19 years, and who answered at 10:15 at night without complaint and without surprise, because Margaret had the emotional intelligence of someone who has watched a family long enough to see its patterns. "The tin," he said. "Who told you to check it?" A pauses that was too small for most people to notice. "Miss Ashford mentioned the discrepancy," Margaret said. "She said she'd noticed the amount seemed off. She was quite insistent that I look into it." Charles set the phone down without ending the call. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he picked it up again. "Margaret," he said, "I need everything you remember about every conversation Miss Ashford has had in this house in the past 2 months. Every room, every person, every comment she made about Miss Davies. Margaret's silence this time was different. It was the silence of someone who has been waiting to be asked. Of course, she said. Should I start now? A called James at midnight. James answered immediately, which meant he had not been asleep, which meant this night had cost his son something too, and that cost sat on Charles's chest for the entire conversation. A did not offer excuses. He said what he had found. A sighed where he had been. He said the word wrong twice in the same sentence, not because he had trouble with the word, but because he felt it needed saying twice. James listened without interrupting. This had always been one of the things Charles admired most about his son, the capacity to listen to a hard thing without filling the air with reaction before the thing was finished being said. When Charles stopped talking, James said, "Is she all right?" "Not. I told you. Not. How could you?" Not any of the things Charles would have forgiven him for saying. "Is she all right?" "I believe so," Charles said. "I left before she came out. You should call her." "I know." "Tonight, Dad." "I know," Charles said again. And then, "I'm sorry, James." James said nothing for a moment. "Tell her that," he said finally. "Not me." It was at the market at 7:30 the next morning. He did not wear the gray jacket or the flat cap. He wore what he wore when he went to board meetings. The clothes that made people understand immediately what kind of person they were speaking to, because it seemed important this time that there be no gap between what he was and what he appeared to be. The market was not yet fully open. She was arranging the trays behind the table, her back to him, placing each tray with the same deliberate care she brought to everything. He stood at the edge of the stall and waited until she turned around. She saw him. Her expression did not change. This did not surprise him anymore. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. He had rehearsed several versions of the opening. He had rehearsed them for 4 hours of a night. He had not slept. He had selected the most precise one, refined it 3 times, and decided on the final version at approximately 6 in the morning. He abandoned all of it. "I went to your brother's flat," he said, "last night. I followed you. I stood outside and I watched through the window, and I saw what you do with the money." She was very still. "I was wrong," he said. "About you. About what I believed you were doing. I was wrong, and I am asking you to accept an apology from a man who does not make a habit of being wrong, and has therefore very little practice at apologizing." Something moved across her face, not the emotion he expected, not relief. Something quieter and more complicated. The expression of a person who has waited a long time for something and is not quite sure how to receive it now that it has arrived. "The shortfall was my doing," he said. "I will make it right immediately. I will increase your brother's medical provision through the household account, properly with his name on a ledger, and that is a beginning, not an end." She looked at him for a long moment. The market moved around them. Voices, footsteps, the sound of crates being shifted. The diagonal bars of light were coming through the skylight again. "Why did you come yourself?" she said. It was not the question he had expected. "I'm sorry? You could have sent someone. You could have called. You've had since last night." She tilted her head very slightly. "Why did you come yourself?" He thought about it. He thought about it honestly, which took longer than if he had simply chosen an answer. "Because it was my mistake," he said. "And because I think Eleanor would have wanted me to." The name of his dead wife in the open air of the market, spoken for the first time in years to someone outside his family, felt like cold water and like warmth at the same time. And he did not entirely understand why he had said it, except that it was true. Evelyn Davies looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Would you like some eggs, Mr. Whitmore?" He laughed. He could not remember precisely the last time he had done that without planning to. "Yes," he said, "I would." What followed was not simple. Nothing of value is. Carolyn Ashford's role in the manufactured evidence was fully documented within 4 days. Margaret's account, the timing of the messages, the conversations she had directed toward the household records with the particular precision of someone who had planted something and was watching it grow. Charles presented this to Carolyn privately, in his office on the 52nd floor, with the city spread below them in the same gray morning light in which he had made his first mistake. It gave her the evidence. He gave her a document. He gave her 1 hour. She left the building without speaking to anyone. The 7% stake her father held in the Whitmore Group's Northern development was resolved through separate, properly documented commercial channels that had nothing to do with what she had done. Because Charles Whitmore had built 28 years of decisions on the principle that personal matters and business matters occupied different rooms, and he was not about to stop now. At the following Sunday lunch at Ashworth Hall, the table was laid for 6. James sat to Charles's left. Evelyn sat to his right, which was where Eleanor had always sat, and Charles had placed her there deliberately. And when she took the chair without comment, he understood that she understood, and nothing further needed to be said about it. Oliver was at the far end of the table in a chair they had brought through from the library, thinner than his photographs, quieter than anyone who hadn't lived through what he'd lived through, with the particular dignity of a young man who has spent considerable time in pain and has not let it make him small. Margaret served the soup. The sound of it, spoon on ceramic, the murmur of a conversation finding its shape, was the warmest thing Charles had heard in 11 years. Oliver asked Charles a question about the building's structural history, because he had apparently studied architecture for 8 months before he got too ill to continue. And Charles answered him with the full attention he gave to questions that interested him, which this one did. After lunch, Charles stood at the window of the sitting room, while James and Evelyn were in the kitchen helping Margaret with the clearing. And Oliver had fallen asleep in the library chair with a book on his chest. The garden was bare in the winter light. A single bird landed on the stone bird bath at the center of the lawn, stood there for a moment, then flew away. Charles watched it go. Eleanor had always said the birds were checking in. He had found this sentimental for many years. He found it somewhat less sentimental now. It turned to the room, to the fire in the grate, to the sound of his son's voice from the kitchen, easy and unhurried, to the boy asleep in the chair with the book, to the weight of everything the past 2 weeks had cost and everything they had perhaps purchased. 3 weeks later, he stood at a ceremony in the atrium of the Whitmore Group's headquarters and announced the establishment of the Charles Whitmore and Oliver Davies Medical Access Fund, a permanent endowment covering insulin, chronic illness medication, and pharmaceutical costs for low-income families across the city, with Oliver Davies named as the founding beneficiary and the person in whose name the ongoing provision for others have been made. Oliver was in the front row in a new coat. He stood when his name was mentioned. He stood very straight. In the second week of March, in the same dining room, at Ashworth Hall where Evelyn had sat across a table from a man who had misread everything she was, the family gathered again. And this time the word family meant something it had not quite meant before, encompassing more people around the same table, with more history between them than most families accumulate in decades. Pressed into the space of a few months, the candle at the center of the table, guttered once in a draft from nowhere, flared bright for a moment, and then settled into a steady, even light. Charles looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the people around the table and picked up his fork. If you have ever worked harder than anyone around you with less recognition than you deserved, if you have ever stood in a room and been judged by everything except the truth, if you have ever carried someone else's survival quietly, without explanation, because the explanation was private and the love was not, then you already know what Evelyn Davies knew when she walked out of that dining room and sat in the sitting room and waited. She knew that dignity is not the same as being believed. It is what remains when belief has been withheld. It is what a person keeps when everything else has been taken away. And she knew, because she had always known it, in the way that people who have had to learn things the hard way tend to know them in their bones, that the person who can walk away from an unjust accusation without begging and without breaking is not walking away from a defeat. They are leaving the room to those who deserve it least and waiting for what comes next, what she could not have known, what none of us can ever know. Waiting in our sitting rooms, with our hands in our laps and our dignity intact, and the judgment of others pressing down from all directions. Is that what comes next? Sometimes comes in the form of a man who spent a night parked on the wrong side of a dark street, watching through a gap in a broken window, learning what he should have trusted his son to know from the beginning. That is what pride does. It costs everything. First, and then, if a person is fortunate and brave enough and has enough time left, it makes way for something better. Some gifts arrive late. They are still gifts,